I'm really interested in the idea of leadership wellbeing from what that means for the psychosocial safety of the individual leaders and how leadership wellbeing impacts one way or the other the overall psychosocial risk of an organisation or the risk profile.
The concept of psychosocial risk is far from new, but the dialogue and industry discussion about the topic has elevated since regulatory changes were announced in 2023 and 2024. Psychosocial risk is now the focus of many conversations in the corporate world, from boardrooms to executive teams, and of course through to the practitioners on the ground, trying to join the dots to have meaningful impact. I'm Kate Connors. I'm a master's qualified psychologist, and my professional purpose is to help people and workplaces be at their best.
And I'm Greg Smith. I'm a lawyer who's spent more than 30 years practicing in the areas of employment law and workplace health and safety. I'm also the author of several books, including Paper Safe and the recently published Proving Safety.
And you are listening to Judgemental, when a psychologist and a lawyer walk into a barside chat about psychosocial risk. A big thanks to our sponsor, EML. EML are Australia's largest personal injury claims provider, providing claims management services to workers' compensation, life insurance and CTP markets with the purpose of helping people get their lives back. We have another jam-packed episode today, so grab a drink and sit back for another discussion at the bar. Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Judgemental. My name's Kate Connors. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I am virtually chatting with Greg Smith on today, being the lands of the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nation. And hello, Mr. Smith. How are you today?
Good. Actually, I'm really good. Having a great day today. I'm on the lands of the Wudjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I would also like to acknowledge them as the traditional owners on the land on which we are meeting and telling stories today, as the Wudjuk people have done on this land for thousands of years.
Well, here we are with a bit of a momentous moment in our little podcast venture. We have our first guest. It's exciting. Are you excited, Greg?
I am, and I think, given that we're in the bar and we've got a guest, I think I will order a bottle of bubbles, which seems a suitable celebration for our first guest.
I'm actually aware that this guest doesn't drink alcohol, so we should also get a bottle of sparkling water. So just to make sure that we're being very inclusive. So while that is being brought over to us, wanted to set the scene about where we're at. We are having looked at the data from the poll, and thank you to EML for putting that poll out there into the universe. We're going to start with the second most requested area of interest to our listening audience, which is leadership wellbeing. And we're going to do 3 episodes as we mentioned. So we've already had 1 episode. We're on to our second episode. And we have the wonderful Audrey McGibbon joining us for a conversation today. Audrey, hello. Take yourself off mute. Say good day. Welcome to the bar.
Hi, Kate. Hi, Greg. Lovely to be here.
Hi.
Thank you for inviting me. I must say I feel very special, honoured to be your first guest. Thank you.
No, we're delighted to have you. We're really looking forward to this addition to our format in terms of having some guests along. But just to set the scene a little bit for our listeners in regards to Audrey. And Audrey, I deliberately didn't ask you to send me a bio. You know how often in these moments people read out a bio and it all gets a bit much?
I do.
So I thought I'd pick out my favourite components that I understand about your background that I thought people would be keen to understand. First is that you're a chartered occupational and coaching psychologist. The second thing that I think is really important for people to understand is that you are a specialist in psychometrics and a self-confessed data nerd. Fair?
Yes. Late development in life, Kate, but yes.
You have 30 plus years experience in leadership development and organisational development generally, particularly in executive coaching and talent management. and you are the CEO and co-founder of the Global Leadership Wellbeing Survey, and you're currently doing your PhD in work addiction.
Oh, wow.
Any errors in any of that we should correct for the record?
I liked it all, but if my supervisor's listening, she would be the first to tell you that I'm now on my third doctorate topic, and so I have reverted. The workaholism has gone by the by.
Oh,
and
okay.
I'm doing it on leader well-being, which is probably even better. I mean, it's an adjacency, isn't it, really? But it's on leader well-being, and a lot of the data that I've been gathering over 10 years I'm now allowed to use, which is fabulous.
Well, I think that means, Greg, that we've got the right person to speak with us today.
I think so.
And I'm very aware that in our last chat, Greg, you made a comment around that when we measure things, it doesn't necessarily have the same impact on outcomes. And are we actually measuring something that's helpful in your proving safety world? So here we are with the measurement experts on leadership wellbeing. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that.
Yep. I mean, I'm overtly cynical, but only because what I see in my world is when we talk about measurement of things that are difficult to measure, and safety, for example, is something that's very difficult to measure, we end up measuring activity and not outcome. So we end up, for example, one of the key indicators that lots of organisations use around safety is the idea of management safety interactions. So managers go out and talk to the workers about safety. And I suspect we're going to start to see that drift into this work health and safety management of psychosocial risk. But we don't end up understanding the efficacy of the management interactions. We count the number that are done, and the key performance indicator for the manager is, have they done the right number for the month? They're held accountable to the number of talks, not to the outcome or the efficacy or the quality of the talks or even the understanding that arises from them. So that's where my sort of cynicism comes from. Just from my perspective, Audrey, I know Kate knows you well, but perhaps you could help me out here. How did you come to be interested in this whole area of leadership wellbeing, and particularly the idea of measuring it?
Thanks, Greg. Gosh, I think Kate set this up to be a bit adversarial between us, but actually No. I'm feeling that we're really on the same page, Greg, because
I agree.
You call cynicism about the measurement. A psychometrician would say, actually, you're just querying the validity of the measure. It is purporting to measure something that your experience and observations would say it isn't actually measuring.
Yeah.
And so, perfect. We have immediate alignment.
We do.
I know I'm going to like you a lot. How did I get into this space? Well, background, inevitably, doing the sorts of things that Kate was mentioning. Leader well-being was always an element of assessing performance and predicting potential for both individuals, teams, and organizations. And when I say it was always there, it was sort of manifesting. We would talk about stress management, resilience, performance under pressure, composure, those sorts of things. But it really all came to a very shiny, glaring crisis of conscience. Can you have a shiny crisis of conscience? Anyway, it was a significant moment, a pivotal moment where I just went, you know what, I really can't peddle my wares in this space without bringing leaders' well-being front and center into the equation. And that moment occurred about 2 to 3 years after the end of the global financial crisis, where my assumptions up until that point were, gee, there's a whole heap of really good, capable, well-intentioned individuals who are in leadership roles at all sorts of levels, who are trying but flagging. I put that down to circumstances, and I fully expected there to be a bit of a rebound and for them to reset back to normal. But 2 or 3 years afterwards, I sort of realized I don't think we're going back to what would have been pre-GFC normal. And that started it.
Wow. The GFC seems to have been a bit of a catalyst for a whole range of shifts in what we understood by normal work, but we're not going to talk about that indirectly today, because that's all we will do. Kate, you can jump in if you've got something. I've got us very...
No, go. What's your question?
Well, this is kind of what we touched on the other day, but I'm interested in this idea of leadership wellbeing as a person who deals mainly in work health and safety law, fundamentally the prosecution of organisations and individuals under criminal law for failing to ensure a safe workplace. That's my lens that sits over these discussions. And I'm really interested in the idea of leadership well-being from two areas. One I think is more easily explainable than the other. So the first one is the idea of leadership well-being and what that means for the psychosocial safety of the individual leaders, which is one element. But then there's the broader organisational aspect, which we're seeing play out a lot, and how leadership well-being impacts one way or the other the overall psychosocial risk of an organisation or the risk profile, or however is best to describe it.
Yeah. When I hear or see in titles of keynotes or papers, leaders' well-being or leadership well-being, I do think it is worth really clarifying, because for me, there are two broad phenomenons, if you like, at play. One is leadership of well-being in an organization for employees at large, and the other is leaders' well-being. And depending on what perspective you take there and which phenomenon you're focused on, how you might go about it and the sorts of commentary you might make would be different.
Okay.
And I would probably even, I don't know, Audrey, what you think about this, but as I listen to Greg's question, I also think there is an additional layer, which is as a consequence of a particular leader's well-being or a particular group of leaders at an enterprise level, what's the aggregate wellness of leaders within a particular team or organization, what does that therefore ripple effect mean into possibilities of psychosocial risk exposure to hazards or mitigation of hazards in a psychosocial kind of context? Does that kind of add to it? Does that make sense to you, Greg? My addition, do you hear what I'm meaning by that additional layer as well?
Okay, what you're saying makes sense, and I get all of that. I guess where I'm sitting from is the narrative that we hear all the time, particularly from health and safety regulators, that throws all of the onus on creating a psychologically safe and I know there's differences, a psychologically safe workplace or managing psychosocial risk in a workplace is all on the leaders and loosely defined at best.
Yeah.
And trying to understand the interplay between looking after leader well-being and organisational capacity to deal with psychosocial risk is something that I'm interested in. Yeah.
And I think that that's probably where we were thinking that would be the great next place for the conversation, Audrey, in terms of when we're at, events in the market, et cetera, and people are very focused on psychosocial risk at an enterprise level and doing those risk assessments.
Yep.
You and I have spoken about, Audrey, that it doesn't seem like where leaders fit into that is of high prevalence in conversation. So what is your current thinking about that in the context of leader well-being being, this way that I'm kind of describing it at the moment, being an untapped opportunity, but also kind of neglecting the risks attached to that particular area?
Yeah. So what I see is going on is that there is a growing interest in the role that leaders have in relation to employee well-being, but it is in leaders as a means to an end. It's in leaders as an agent of improving the psychosocial health risks within an organization for their employees. And to Greg's earlier point, that then, of course, is really sort of over egging the accountability for the psychosocial health regulation and compliance obligations. It is putting it too squarely, in my belief, on the shoulders of the leaders. I think it's appropriate the leaders are accountable to a degree, but it's the oversimplification and the expectation that leaders can somehow magically start to do something that will make a meaningful difference. And I think it just completely disregards the complexity that I know you've talked about in previous episodes, but the complexity of the interplay between individual factors, team factors, job design factors, leadership culture, all of those things, and emphasizing that leaders are now accountable for psychosocial health risk reduction is kind of perverse in a way, because leaders are themselves humans and subject to the same vulnerabilities well, actually not the same. My argument would be they're subject to greater pressures and stressor demands than on average many other. I mean, different. They're different and they're of a different magnitude. So it's a really it's a very convoluted picture where the blunt instrument is, oh, right, well, we need to do psychosocial health training for leaders to, in the worst case, comply with our obligations. And in a slightly less worse place, because we realize that leaders are an important instrument or lever, Kate, to use your earlier expression. Leaders are a really important lever to get better wellbeing outcomes across the organization. But it kind of feels a bit callous and counterproductive, actually, because unless we focus, first of all, on leaders and their own well-being, you're kind of on hiding to nothing.
So
I've stunned you both.
No, I'm wondering about, well, Greg, where's your brain going?
I think for me, that's kind of reinforced what I think anybody who thinks about this for any length of time would understand is. But again, part of the problem is that the issue of psychosocial health hit a tripwire in about April 2023 when we introduced new psychosocial regulations into the legislation. And it was like no one sort of appreciated that these obligations have always existed.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we're trying to fix all of these things so quickly because we have to, because we've now got all this perceived new regulatory regime. And all of the efforts to fix it, and this will be part of your language audit for me, no doubt, Audrey, but it fits into this mechanistic kind of work health and safety approach where you just try and slap some policies and procedures and we think that's how we're going to manage this particular risk. And in part, the legislation forces us down that path. I mean, we haven't really been, unless you're an organisation that was already on this journey for your own purposes, most organisations really haven't thought, in my view, very much about the idea of we need to have our leaders in the right place to contribute to the outcomes we want in the organisation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and individually and collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. They haven't. Yeah.
Yeah, because when you look at many of the hazards, I often find myself thinking, well, I think people are a bit delusional about how much power and authority and influence a single leader has in an organization. So I don't know about you, but I don't come across many leaders who have the agency to solely determine somebody's workload, their exposure to bullying, harassment, the hours that they're working, their flexibility about where they get to work. Any of, you could recite them like poetry, I'm sure, Greg, but so many of those hazards, the way people experience them is a function of a multiplier effect across an organization. It just seems like a fallacy to think that an individual leader could be accountable for them.
So in the context of thinking through where organizations are doing that, and a lot of, like we all know that a lot of organizations are adopting this approach of the intervention being led to a whole lot of leadership training on psychosocial risk, right? So let's try and explain to our leaders what psychosocial risks are and their responsibilities and the area of agency that they have over those hazards, right? I don't know, Greg, you and I sometimes tic-tac about this. Surely that's better than nothing at all, right? In terms of increasing the sophistication of leaders' understanding of where there is a moment that they can positively impact something, where previously they had no knowledge or very little knowledge of that. But it is interesting, there's a friend of mine who runs those kind of training, and she said to me that now that she's out there running that kind of training, she often has my leadership system stuff in the back of her head, thinking, I'm not sure if it's very fair that we're asking leaders to do this when we're not really properly, fulsomely understanding what's happening for them in the system that they're operating in. So I don't know, again, I find myself in this torn situation in terms of what is it, therefore, that we should be suggesting to organisations? Like, what's the way forward? What's your thoughts on that, Audrey?
The way forward would have to be to recognise that perhaps because of the imperfections in the way that both the legislation has been drafted, I suppose, and the limitations of applying a physical health and safety risk model to managing those hazards as drafted in legislation. Perhaps we have to recognize that organizations must clearly try and comply, and therefore they must clearly have some procedural training and skills that address that. But that we take a step back in framing this as this is what it is. This is about meeting the obligations of a blunt instrument. And let's not get confused between that and our loftier aspirations of actually, A, doing no harm to you as leaders and all of your people, and B, making jobs and the experience of work something that can contribute positively to our well-being. So stop the avoidable harm and make it better. But I think there's a conflation of that. And a really practical term, an example of that would be people or organizations repointing what they had in their budgets for leadership development or well-being support towards compliance training.
Yeah.
Thinking that they were moving towards the same outcomes. I see them as very different needs and outcomes, Kate.
Yeah. Yeah. That's well described. I get what you're saying about that for sure.
I get a little bit cranky when I'm not sure you meant to do it, but when we sort of draw this line that says on the one hand, here's the achievement of the outcome, and on the other, here is compliance, particularly in a work health and safety perspective, because compliance is so often conflated with almost a checkbox exercise. We've got the piece of paper, we've got the signature on the page, therefore we have compliance, whereas particularly in the context of work health and safety, compliance is the achievement of the outcome. And so in the case of psychosocial hazards, have we done everything reasonably practicable to manage the risks of psychosocial hazards in the business? Now, merely providing training to our leaders on what psychosocial hazards are and how to manage them is not doing everything reasonably practicable unless we understand that training is effective and implemented in the workplace.
Gosh, Greg.
And has created a positive reduction in psychosocial risk as well. Would that not be right, Greg? That you're evaluating whether that has actually had the positive impact that you are hoping it would have?
This is where I don't think the WHS framework is really quite fit for purpose for psychosocial risk for the reasons we've discussed. There's two parts. Do we have proper systems to manage the hazards? And I'm sure if you and Audrey got together, you could say, well, this is a proper system to manage the hazards that could give rise to psychosocial harm. But the test is, do we know if those systems are implemented and effective? That's kind of the second part of the equation. So understanding if it's implemented or effective, I think, is really what the challenge looks like in this area.
Greg, I think what you're seeing in this space is a microcosm of what's happening across organizations and across all disciplines. It's a symptom of the changing world that we're living in. I mean, the measurement that we're doing shows very clearly that since we started measuring it in 2016, leaders at all levels, who essentially is tantamount to professionals and knowledge workers with a few years at least experience, they are reporting significantly higher levels of work-related concerns. So lower work-related well-being, lower outside of work well-being, lower overall well-being, lower happiness, lower satisfaction. And when we look at why that is, the expectations and pressures that they're under to deliver are not achievable. And therefore, it's driving this culture of, well, we focus on what is something that we can show that we've done within this business cycle. So we know we can't show that we've made a material difference to mental health and well-being within a 12-month and get it all measured and ticked off. But we can show that we've implemented these courses and these people have attended. And so I think that's kind of what business is like today. We're focusing on the short cycle about what can be done.
Yep. And what's demonstrable in a lot of ways. Yeah. There's an interesting work done by Dr. Dave Proven and Professor Drew Ray from Griffith University in the context of safety, which talks about lots of different types of safety, and part of it is like there's social safety, which is what we do internally to emphasize that safety is important. There's demonstrated safety. What are the activities we do to show that we're being safe, taking safety seriously, none of which may actually have any positive effect on the physical safety of the work. And in some cases can undermine the physical safety of the work. So you get a lot of overlapping purposes, I think, intersecting. And I see that playing out in the world of psychosocial risk as well.
Yeah, and I think you've mentioned in previous sessions about the concerns that you have over sort of superficial, surface level tokenism that sort of manifests as progress, but really you're going, is that progress? And Kate and I would have had many conversations about wellbeing washing, being seen to be doing the right thing. And I suppose I am sounding cynical and judgmental on that. Oh, good, I'm on the Judgemental-podcast.
Yeah.
Excellent.
You're
I'm
in the right
place. But I just feel tremendous care, upset, concern, compassion for the people whose jobs it is to trying to do this stuff. So whether you're coming at it because you're responsible in the workplace health and safety land, or you're the people and culture director, or you're head of organizational development, or you are, leading business strategy, the lever that we have, the opportunity that we have to make people weller is significant, and business will improve. We know that. The data's there to show it. But you just can't do it through appointing it to a handful of individuals. It's got to be across the system.
So This is a question then for both of you. And I was scared that I was going to be a bit of a fifth wheel on this podcast while you two got together and talked leadership, but I get to pick on both of you. I'm really curious because how much almost of an overload, and I'm thinking, I know this is a global phenomenon and I know it's globally problematic, but how much do you think it's almost been a sudden shock to the system, the introduction of these new regulations has been, compared to what was going along traditionally, and we're building up and we're saying this is more important when all of it, and then we drop the gate on it and say, oh, by the way, bang, here's a series of regulations and we're going to hold you personally accountable against those. Because I've been a lawyer for 35 years and we've always talked about leadership and the importance of leadership to organisations and cultures, and we've always struggled to translate that into practice. But now we've sort of dropped this fence or this gate on it and said, and by the way, now we're really pursuing accountability for this in a way that we probably didn't before.
Yeah, I think that's the bit that scared the bejesus out of people is and you are now going to be held personally account. I think that's one stressor that's been massive. And the other one is that while there has always been an obligation in law to manage foreseeable harm to people, it was this kind of shift to personal accountability. And the fact that I think whether it was a combination of those in people and culture not being fully aware of this being in the system and about to arrive and about to drop, or, those of us who are working the psychology space not being very good at influencing people in organizations, or workplace health and safety people not being good at influencing. But I just don't think there was a strategic awareness about it coming. And then I think it overcorrected. It hit a bit of a panic button, and it's kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Because my sense is that politically before the regulations, it was always marketed as something that was good for business, as opposed to now you've got this duty. Sorry, Kate, I cut across there.
No, you're right. I think that there are a couple of additional factors in the sense that, firstly, what the regulators have been trying to do to turn the numbers around just hasn't been working. So this is out of a sense of desperation in a way that they've had to do something else. When you look at the unaffordability of the workers' compensation schemes, etc., I think that that's a component to what's happening. So when those schemes are unaffordable, then it goes back to the workplace health and safety space in terms of, well, what are we doing to prevent these things in the first place? So I think that's one component to it. But I also think, to your earlier point, Greg, that, and this is also piggybacking off what Audrey was saying, internally in organisations, there tends to be, let's piggyback off there's a legal compliance. Now the organization has to do it. There's a compliance component to this. Yeah. And I think that's real. But what you just said, Greg, how good was that kind of explanation that you gave in terms of what compliance actually is? No one out in the world that I speak to in terms of workplace health and safety speaks about what compliance actually is the way that you just described what compliance actually is, in the sense of the complex interplay of actually seeing a positive outcome. But that's almost the same way as how Audrey and I might get frustrated about how people think that well-being is a really simple thing to, just do this or just do that. Then you kind of, doing the best that you can to try to create well-being. It feels as though, Greg, you've got the same frustration around when people use the word compliance. Just because some training's been done and someone signed a piece of paper, suddenly you're compliant, and you're saying, no, that's not what compliance is. Yep. So they were just a couple of things that were rolling around in my head as I was listening to you guys speak before. And I do think, Audrey she's used the phrase a lot in this space, the wicked problem. And I think that's what we're doing in this conversation at the moment, is we're just kind of, again, highlighting for listeners the complexity of this challenge and the wickedness of this problem. And if it was an easy fix, someone would have done it already, but it's not.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the additional consideration of leadership wellbeing and the need to have a systemic consideration around leadership wellbeing is something. It's not being done. No organizations are really effectively doing this. So maybe that's another component that needs to be considered if we are going to see positive change in this space. Which probably, sorry, Greg, you go yet?
No, sorry, Kate, you finish.
I was just going to say, I was going to throw to Audrey there in terms of what's her view on that and where is she seeing, if anywhere, some great examples of when fulsome and meaningful focus on leadership wellbeing and looking at the system that leaders are operating in is happening, and some positive outcomes all the way through to psychosocial outcomes. Have you got any case studies that you can share with listeners, any best practice that you are seeing?
Yeah, I've got a few. And I think it's the organizations who acknowledge that they need to simplify this very complex stuff to be able to turn it into practical strategies and everyday behaviors without that being equivalent to, a stupid level of reductionism that doesn't get anyone anywhere. And so an example would be an organization who has been on the journey for quite some time. They did have some significant psychosocial health related challenges at certain levels in the organization. And as a result of that and other things that they were trying to shift in their culture and improve in their organization, they introduced measuring the well-being of predominantly their most senior leaders and aspiring leaders. And they did that in a layered, quite subtle way. So it could be if somebody wanted coaching or somebody expressed that they were concerned about their, how they were traveling, their either their mental health or just like, I'm struggling, I'm feeling a bit flat, or I'm not sure that this is right for me. They might be offered this as an intervention through to they'd use it, they'd incorporate it into talent development programs, they incorporated it into some DE&I type initiatives. And so over the course of 3 years, they've amassed a set of data in an appropriate, sensitive way using reliable, valid tool, because it's mine. But it's been well positioned. So individuals complete this and they get immediate benefit through seeing their own results reflected back to them. And there is a meaningful conversation and insights and awareness around what factors they can control in relation to improving their well-being at work and outside of work, and factors that are a bit messier and more complicated. And so for whatever reason they've done the tool, the organization is able to roll up the aggregated, de-identified data and say, okay, well, some things we're seeing improvements on, but in other areas, we've got some concerns. And I'll just search to see if I can find some of the data while I'm talking to you. There was one example of this, that when they rolled up the data, they realized that 38% of their senior leaders, their most senior, their top 200, were describing themselves as feeling underutilized with more to offer. So in other words, that's the not having a job that is sufficiently intellectually stimulating and engaging, at the same time as close to 50% of them feeling at risk of burnout due to, excessive demands and speed of needing to work against the clock on a daily basis. So there were some real messages in there about, okay, from both a skill development, talent retention, and getting the best out of people and making sure that their work is supporting their mental health. There's some stuff we need to change about the way we're designing their work. And they wouldn't have got that had they only stuck at the individual intervention, but they wouldn't have got access to that data had they not looked at the aggregated collective stuff. And there were positives as well. This is an organization that had set out to try and improve the interpersonal dynamics at the top and then therefore the ripple effect across the organization. And they were really pleased in the reduction of reporting of politics, experience of office politics and toxic working relationships. They weren't at zero, but they were down to single figures, percentage terms of people reporting concerns about those. So it was pretty impressive at the aggregated level. And what I liked about it wasn't a massive overcooked intervention.
Yeah.
It was sensibly deployed, but systematic, methodical, with a plan, and focused on benefiting the individual in a real way while serving the organization's needs to manage and oversight what's going on.
Greg, what are your thoughts when you hear that? Like I kind of do listen and hear and get to work in that kind of way all the time, but do you hear organizations putting that kind of focus into trying to distill what's working and what's not working for their leaders in the way that Audrey's just described?
No, I don't. But to be fair, I'm not sure that that's something that an organisation would necessarily raise with their lawyer until something had gone wrong.
Yeah. Then
you would ask for the evidence. What have you been doing to manage the risk and look at it in that context? But again, I think it's like any intervention that you look at, either HR safety intervention, and again, you contrast what's been described by Audrey as a planned process with an objective and an outcome in mind that is then measured and the data is collected, and you go back and look at the data and you say, what's the data telling us? And then you move on to the next step, as opposed to we're going to run mental first aid training for our organisation and we're going to have 90% of the people trained in the next 12 months and the traffic light on the health and safety report at the end of the month is green because the correct number of people have been trained.
Yeah.
They don't even have a baseline to say, what are the psychosocial risks we're trying to address before we start this program? 12 months later, what's changed in relation to those psychosocial risks? It's just this baseline, crack in an initiative, make sure we measure the activity so we know it's been done, wait for the next silver bullet and whack in that initiative.
Yeah. And I think that is the difference between, to Audrey's earlier point around what is it that you're measuring and why, in the context of a frequency measure, like you're just doing a frequency count, versus a tool that is designed to measure the system itself and the factors within a system that evidence informs do either positively or negatively impact outcome. Is that?
Yeah.
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 But what I took away from it, and this is something that I try to do a lot of work with clients on, is understanding what it is you're concerned about. So it sounds from what Audrey was describing, there was a concern in the organisation. And so they decided to have a process to address that concern and a system of reporting that would give them some insight into whether or not their concern was being addressed. A very good colleague of mine used to refer to this idea of random acts of safety. So organisations and managers would be running around randomly doing stuff for safety without any real alignment.
Randomly being safe.
Yeah, without any real alignment or purpose behind, we are doing this initiative because we have this concern and now we can measure the effect on that concern. So part of what I advocate in traditional safety is this idea of deep dives. Pick a concern, understand what you think you're doing to manage that concern, get into your organisation, really understand that concern and whether your initiatives are affecting that or not. Because I go to the earlier point when you started describing some of this as a wicked problem. And one of the characteristics of wicked problems is that your solutions can create different unintended consequences. And I don't have any data to prove this, it's all anecdotal. But I think one of the unintended consequences of organisations suddenly being very proactive about psychosocial risk is that they're creating a lot of noise about psychosocial risk without having any understanding about the influence of that noise on their people. And so their efforts to promote and manage psychosocial risk are creating less safe environments for some people, or increasing the level of cynicism, which creates unsafe workplaces for some people.
Well, of course, you hit on a point that in an inflamed system where we know, based on the data, that more people are experiencing symptoms of burnout, which include cynicism, detachment, being quick to flare, quick to anger, irritable, snappier than usual. So the more pressure we put on people, if that's a leader who's now suddenly feeling really exposed and vulnerable and insecure and anxious, as many are when we speak to them about kind of what this new psychosocial health stuff means for them, or you're reporting into leaders and you've maybe kind of not quite picked up the right end of the stick about what the psychosocial health rights are. It's a bit like the right to disconnect stuff as well. There's a lot of room for misinterpretation and misunderstanding. And what we know is when people are on the cusp of being unwell and fatigued and tired, they're far more likely to take things in ways that were never intended and for things to blow up. And you must see that all the time in your work, Greg. You know, once the harm's done, it's really hard to wind it back from there. So I just think, slowing it down, being more purposeful, absolutely tuning into the stuff that is inflammatory, really. Oh, you're all feeling really super overworked, so let's put on yoga lunchtime classes. Or it's like, are you kidding me?
With that inflammatory response idea in mind, I'm conscious, Greg, we also spoke last time, or was it the episode before, in regards to the concept of bring your whole self to work. And how that's got all of us, I think we all just did a little nod there, how that's kind of playing out on the ground for leaders in particular in regards to them feeling safe agency to step into managing psychosocial risk, intervening when they think that they should. Audrey, what's your kind of reflection on this intersection of bring your whole self to work, psychosocial risk, but be a good leader and be perfect all the time, and, all of those things, and don't hurt anyone, but also manage performance. And I think there is a right way to navigate it, but kind of curious on how you speak to leaders about that.
I think it's like one of the leadership paradox principles, isn't it? That be strategic, be detailed, lead from the front, but support people from behind. And it's, with the psychosocial health stuff, it's be your authentic self, bring your whole self to work. Oh, but be very careful you don't think, look, say, do, act, imply anything that might be not to another person's liking. And I think that's a bit that hasn't maybe come through in tonight's conversation or this morning's, wherever you are, conversation, is the subjectivity of how people experience these different, what are classed as, I suppose, the hazards, but the example being flexibility. If you give some people with certain individual traits a lot of flexibility, or even a really lovely supportive manager, it is highly likely, or at least probable, that you may harm their well-being. I'm not saying the alternative is an evil draconian boss with no control allowed, but I am saying too much autonomy, too much flexibility with somebody who's super lovely and inspiring, when you've got the individual concerned with a high need to please and no boundaries and lots of workaholic tendencies. In my mind, that's a foreseeable risk, but there's nowhere for that in the way things are managed at the moment.
No. And because organisations like static's not the right word, but they like a solution to put into a workplace, you can't individualise everything. That's part of the problem of what we're dealing with.
But
I wonder if
automate. Sorry, you go, Kate.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I've lost what I was going to say. I think I was going to kind of bring that authentic self and be your whole self piece, though, into almost connecting it back into Greg's point around what is compliant. Because I do think that in organisations at the moment, particularly in large organisations, this risk averse, the bring your whole self to work piece is such a high part of the employee value proposition and the cultural design that people have lost sight of, well, what actually is bullying or what actually is a behaviour that is inappropriate versus somebody just being a bit grumpy that day. I think to your point, Greg, making sure that people don't just think that, making sure everyone's nice to each other all the time equals that we're being compliant in positive duty to manage bullying is so counterproductive if we refer back to that episode that we had on the importance of conflict, and innovation comes from conflict, and new ideas come from conflict, and authenticity and relationships build in successfully navigating and speaking to each other about a moment that was difficult or hard. Yeah, again, I don't know. It's just
You could even take it further though, Kate. You could say that the presence of a permanently nice environment could be harmful to your psychological well-being, because if you're someone who's got a high intellect, high need for meaning and purpose, a high need for integrity in a conversation, and there is no room or space in which to have an honest and open conversation, that is certainly, I would have thought, detrimental to their sense of meaning and purpose and fulfillment from their work, which is counter to the spirit of what we're trying to achieve. So, I think definitely the espoused, we want everybody to bring their whole selves and be authentic at work, versus the reality of that does not feel safe. And it does not feel safe, I think, increases the more senior you are in the organisation. Perhaps there's a level of protection at certain very senior levels, but I think the psychosocial health emphasis has made people step back from taking action in their day-to-day, everyday leadership. They're thinking twice, 3 times, 4 times, and then thinking, actually, I just won't go there.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm conscious of time.
Yeah. We always get to a moment when we're conscious of time.
So I'm going to ask both of you, because this is your areas of expertise, one key takeaway each that people are listening. Leadership wellbeing is important. It's important for individual leaders. It's important for the overall wellbeing of the organisation. Just one key takeaway that we think organisations should turn their minds to. Might not be able to put it any higher than that when they're grappling with the wicked problem of leadership wellbeing. Audrey, I'll toss to you first.
Every leader is an individual. Don't make assumptions about what they need, and treat leaders as humans.
I like that. Kate?
Well, mine would be, you can measure leader wellbeing and then therefore have a better understanding of what that individual does need, and then aggregate it across a system to understand what's actually going on within a leadership system. Bang!
I'd second that. Bang.
Bang. Thank you
I wish
both.
I'd said that, Kate.
Oh, no, you said all the smart stuff. I've just been listening today. Well,
I was thinking it.
Audrey, thank you so much for being our first
Thank
guest.
you, Audrey.
It was lovely to have you. Did you enjoy your sparkling water with lime?
Well, actually, I had a very strong cup of tea, which I am the sort of embarrassing person that does, in fact, say in a pub, "Oh, is there any chance of a cuppa?" Much to my partner's mortification.
Oh.
One of the great Australian rules football coaches and players of all time, Tommy Hafey, was a cup of tea man as well. So,
Well,
Nothing wrong with that.
Well, before we sign off, I just wanted to give a little taster to everybody in terms of the next and final episode on our deep dive into leader wellbeing, where I won't say exactly who, but we have a CEO who is prepared to come on and have a chat with Greg and I in regards to their experience as a CEO leading psychosocial risk within their organisation, as well as their experience for them and their leadership team going through an investigation from a regulator in regards to a psychosocial risk complaint. So it should be a really interesting conversation to bring Greg's point through again in terms of what is all of this, what are some of the unintended consequences that are going on for people. And I thought that would be a really fascinating conversation in terms of the impact on leaders in trying to navigate all this. So,
would they like to do the GRWS, Kate?
Oh, maybe they would, Audrey. Maybe they would. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for coming to the bar. And
thank you.
See everybody next, or listen to everybody next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
See ya.
That's a wrap for another episode of Judgemental. Thanks again to our sponsors, EML. EML's Mutual Benefits Program provides organisations with free services, tools and resources to manage their workplace risk. You can follow EML, myself and Greg on LinkedIn, and be sure to check the show notes for links to the papers referenced in each episode, as well as resources available to help you as you navigate the wonderfully complex and nuanced world of psychosocial risk. See you again next time at the bar.